Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Animas Corporation, providing insulin delivery products for people living with diabetes and part of the One Touch family. And by Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes with the world's first continuous glucose monitoring system that sends glucose readings directly to your compatible smart device. Live life on your own terms with Dexcom. Hi, it's Stacey. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, Adventure On. The author of that book knows a bit about adventure and diabetes. Diagnosed at 19, she completed a solo sail around the Florida Keys.
Yeah, the experience was 5 days, but that moment of knowing I did something cool and something that I'll always remember, it sticks with you. And it gives you confidence doing every other little thing that you do in your life.
Erin Spineto says you don't have to be a solo sailor or an extreme outdoorsman to shake out of a diabetes slump. We'll talk about her advice, how her health challenges include more than type 1, and what she's up to for her next adventure. Plus, a little bit about a family vacation we took over the winter break. How taking our own little adventure, helped me let go a little bit more than usual. And some fun upcoming events. Love to see you there. It all starts now on Diabetes Connections. Welcome to another week of Diabetes Connections. I'm Stacey Sims. If you're brand new to the show, Diabetes Connections aims to educate and inspire about type 1 diabetes through interviews and conversations with authors and advocates and newsmakers in our community, as well as everyday people who aren't sailing solo around the Florida Keys, but who are just trying to live day to day with all the challenges that type 1 diabetes brings. My son was diagnosed with type 1 10 years ago. He's 12 now. I'm a former radio and TV local anchor and host, and I have been hosting this podcast since the summer of 2015. A couple of fun things coming up. Just want to tell you about and let you know. We'll be participating in, or you can come out and meet me or find out more about these kinds of events, maybe in your own backyard. The first is coming up this weekend. Me and the kids are going to Riding on Insulin's ski and snowboard camp in Virginia. I hesitate only because we do not ski or snowboard. But I thought this would be really, really fun. And they assure me that beginners are welcome. So what is riding on insulin? Well, we actually talked about this almost at this exact time last year. Right out of the gate in 2016, we talked to Michelle Allswager and talked about riding on insulin, among many other things. Riding on insulin helps train athletes for triathlons and extreme races and things like that. But they also help kids with what they call global action sports programs. So basically they teach kids and teens and even some adults living with type 1 to ski and to snowboard. This was founded by Sean Busby, and he was diagnosed as an adult while training for the 2010 Olympics. Quite a story there. In fact, I need to track down Sean Busby and do an interview with him for this show. But we have decided to go check it out. There are still many programs available this winter, maybe some near you. I will hook up Riding on Insulin at diabetes-connections.com so you can learn more, and I'll definitely report back. I'm sure the program is great. It's just going to be funny because we've done snow tubing before, but, you just lay down for that. Skiing, I skied as a kid for about 5 minutes. But, we're in the South, and we're not too far from the mountains, but it just isn't something that we've done. So at the moment, I am talking to all of my friends to try to get enough clothing. We don't have snow pants. We don't have goggles. We have nothing. It's going to be quite the comedy, but I know we're going to have a great time. The other event that's coming up fast is my local chapter's Type 1 Nation Summit. So a lot of the local JDRF chapters will do these yearly or bi-yearly summits. And it's a great day to get together with other families, people in your area touched by type 1, and learn more about resources that are available, hear from experts. So they usually call them Type 1 Nation. The name changes every couple of years as JDRF changes their branding. So we're doing that in Greenville, South Carolina later in January. I'm not doing a presentation at this one. I've done quite a few in the past, but I am going to be doing some podcast interviews and beef up my community connections segment. And if you're not familiar with that, quite often I really like to include at least once or twice a month a community connections segment in the show. And that's with somebody who, isn't really in the spotlight, doesn't want to talk for 40 minutes about their experience with type 1, but maybe has a great story they want to share. I guess you'd call that like an everyday person or a man on the street kind of interview. But they've been a lot of fun because, we all have something to say about this. We all have advice to give or stories to tell. And I like doing those interviews in person because, most people who don't usually give interviews are more comfortable maybe one-on-one. But if that sounds good to you, and if you think you've got a great story or something you just want to share, even by email, and you'd rather not be recorded, just drop me a line, Stacey at diabetes-connections.com. And I'm working on putting something on the website in the weeks to come where you'll be able to just click a button and tell your story, and then we can share it with other people if you prefer to do it that way. So Type 1 Nation Summit is coming up, and I hope to share those community connections in the weeks and months to come. It was really cool to talk to Erin Spineto. She's really interesting. When you talk to someone whose day-to-day life is as a middle school teacher, she teaches 7th grade, and she's got 2 kids at home. But she really, really wanted to get away from it all for a while and just sail. Not so easy to do when you have type 1 diabetes. But you're going to hear how she did it. And I want to let you know that we're giving away a copy of her book. The book is called Adventure On, and this is a social media contest. So just go to Diabetes Connections on Facebook, look for the post about the contest. It'll have a big picture of the book Adventure On. Just comment on that post, and you are entered to win. The contest will end on Tuesday, January 17th. You can enter on the 17th. But please go to the Facebook page. It'll be really easy to find. Again, it's the post with the picture of the book, and the contest will be explained there. Quick word from our sponsor, from Animas. And I was really excited to see, we talked about this last week, that with the new insulin delivery system, Animas and One Touch are coming together. I have been happy with Animas and its product for the nearly 10 years we've been using Animas pumps for Benny. We also love the One Touch products that help us make managing his diabetes more simple. Putting these 2 brands together makes perfect sense to me, and now One Touch has an even wider range of products available to help people confidently move forward in managing their diabetes. To find out more about Animas, part of the One Touch family, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Animas, part of the One Touch family logo. Since we're talking about adventure today, I thought this would be a good episode to share a little bit about our adventure. I'm going to call it an adventure over winter break. We were so lucky. We went to the Galapagos Islands. Unbelievable. I mean, it was just one of those vacations where you can't believe it when, you decide you're going to go, and then you can't believe it when you're there. It was incredible. And we went extended family. There were 10 of us because it was my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. So it was my mom and dad, my sister and her family, me and my husband and our 2 kids. And, the way you have to go, they're so careful. They protect, who's allowed. And it's incredible. So we flew to Ecuador. Then we flew to Baltra on the Galapagos Islands. Then you take a little boat to your boat, which is not a big cruise ship or anything like that. It's a very comfortable, wonderful boat, but it's not like it's not Royal Caribbean or Carnival or anything like that. And then every day you take, and I was calling it a dinghy. It's not a dinghy. It's a panga or a Zodiac, because a dinghy doesn't have a motor. Okay, I'm trying to be good. So we would take the panga, little boat, every day off the big boat and go visit one of these incredible islands and see all the beautiful animals, wildlife. And they explain while you're there, this isn't SeaWorld. Nobody's trained or tame. And you don't know what you're going to see. But the animals are so used to people that they don't see you as a threat. So you can get within, 6 feet of a group of sea lions or you have to step right over these giant clumps of marine iguanas, which are gross. But we snorkeled with, they spit at you. They spit at each other. They never spat at us, really, unless you're dumb and get too close. But I guess they're beautiful in their own way. And we also, we snorkeled every day. And that was wild. Benny really wanted to do that. I like to snorkel, but when they told us we'd be snorkeling with sharks, I was not too excited about that. But I went because he was going, and, I went. It was absolutely incredible. And we did see some reef sharks. And I kept saying, if they look at me, I'm out. I'm going back to the panga. And, or put me in a dinghy. I don't care what you call it. But they were very good. The sharks just swam around below us and did not look up, which would have given me a heart attack. But I'm telling you all of this. Yeah, it comes back to diabetes, I promise. Because we have been fortunate to travel with this extended group with the 10 of us before. But this was different. We've always had connecting rooms or been in the same hotel room with our kids. And we didn't this time. The boys, Benny and his cousin, were in their own room. They were one floor below us. And the Dexcom the Dexcom share is not working on a trip like this because there's no Wi-Fi, there's no cell service at all. And yeah, I'm sure I could have worked something out with Night Scout, but I didn't need to. I didn't need to for this trip. He wore the Dexcom, and we brought the receiver. Which was fine until the snorkeling and the on and off with the wetsuit and all that. After a couple of days, he'd had enough with replacing the Dexcom, so we left it off for the last few days of the trip. But it was very different for me because Benny is 12 now. Remember, he was diagnosed right before he turned 2. So over the years, I've had to give him more and more independence. And when I say that, I don't just mean like let him go down the block by himself. I mean things like not doing everything for him. If you're a parent of a kid who was diagnosed very young, these are challenges. You've always filled the cartridge. You've always changed the inset. You've always made sure they have everything they need. And as they get older, you have to let them do more and more, even if they mess it up a little bit. And man, that is so hard. But he did great. And yeah, of course, I was right there with him, making sure he had what he needed, making sure that his glucose levels were fine before he would snorkel. I don't mean that sort of thing. We took care of all the big stuff and we double checked. But even just sleeping in a separate room and making sure, okay, you've got a juice box next to you, or you've got your Gatorade tabs, and here's the phone, and here's my number, and your cousin, you wake him up if you need anything. That was hard for me. He did have one overnight low that he felt lousy enough to come get me, but he came up the stairs and got me. And he had one really lousy high from a bent cannula, above 400. But for the rest of the trip, with weird food and lots of activity, and he did fine. It was really great. And I'm glad that we're remembering this trip for my parents' 50th wedding anniversary on board the ship, which was so much fun, for swimming with sharks, for having a red-footed booby land on us. It's a bird. I'll put a picture out on diabetes-connections.com. I'll put some of that out there. And yeah, the bird landed on some of the people on the tour, including me and Benny. He was this crazy bird that just liked people. We weren't feeding him. We weren't doing anything we weren't supposed to do. That was crazy. So I hope you have your own adventure this year, whether it's going to the Galapagos or letting your kid have a sleepover or just trying something new. And that's what we're going to talk about with Erin Spineto in just a second. Real quick word from Dexcom. And one of the biggest surprises to me when we started using the share functionality of the Dexcom system was how much more independence it gives Benny. Knowing I could help him manage diabetes in real time, whether he was at a friend's house or school or a sleepover or on an overnight field trip, gave me peace of mind while letting him be the kid he wants to be. With the Dexcom G5 mobile CGM system, dynamic glucose data can be accessed and shared safely and conveniently to your compatible smart device as long as there is an internet connection. The Dexcom G5 mobile is the only CGM approved for adults and children ages 2 years and older with diabetes. For more information, go to Dexcom.com. My guest this week wants you to get your adventure on, worry less, and manage your diabetes through thinking about adventure. This is such a cool idea. Erin Spineto is actually a previous author. She wrote a terrific book called Islands and Insulin. And when you talk about adventure, man, this is a big one. She was diagnosed with type 1 as a teenager, but an older teenager at 19 years old. And she did a 100-mile solo sail down the Florida Keys. Then she led the first all Type 1 team to a swim around Key West, paddled up the intra-coastal waterway in North Carolina, and teaches junior high. I don't know what the bigger challenge is, but Erin, thank you for joining me and welcome to Diabetes Connections.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tell me about this newest endeavor. We're going to go back and talk about your adventures and what motivated you in the first place. But the book is called Adventure On. But it's not just about your adventures. This is about encouraging other people. Tell me about the motivation to write it.
Well, one of the things I saw in each year of my adventures was that when I had an adventure on the books, I had some reason to take better care of my diabetes. You know, it's hard when the doctors tell you, oh, yeah, in 50 years, you might have some problems. And you're like, well, that's 50 years away. So it doesn't bring any motivation. But knowing that I have a trip in, 9 months to train for, every blood sugar counts. And I want to make sure that, I have everything in order so that tomorrow I'll feel good and I can train. And that sort of short-term goal made my adventures really impact my diabetes. And I wanted to take that formula and put it out there so other people could tap into that for whatever it is that they want to adventure on. And so it really just goes step by step through thinking about the things that inspire you, picking an adventure, through how do you plan that, how do you train, how do you do your nutrition, and then ways to share that with other people so that they can be inspired, too, to use adventure to take care of their diabetes.
That's a great point, because even if you don't have a physical adventure, like what we're going to talk about that you have done, if you have a short-term goal, and here we are, as we're talking here in the beginning of January, to, when everybody's setting their New Year's resolutions, it's so hard to look 6 months or a year down the line, or as you said, in 20, 50 years, you're going to have these complications. It's so much easier to say, in 3 weeks, I'm going to go skiing, or in 4 weeks, I want to visit my family, and we're going to do something like, go to a museum. It doesn't even have to be a big sport. I think that's a great idea. And is that what you found over your time when you were just, these are remarkable goals that you've accomplished, but even when you're going on a regular sail?
Yeah, and I found also that a year sometimes is too long, and so I usually pick like minor, what I call micro adventures, a 2-day hike, or just going out for, whatever it is, a race or something smaller more frequently to kind of break up that whole long year. Those help. And also for me, it's every Sunday I have a long ride or a long paddle, and that's kind of like my weekly big adventure where I spend, that time doing the long run. And so I need to make sure that everything leading up to that week is in order so that I can hit that goal. And it's amazing how much it turns something that is, I don't want to say a punishment, but something that's a task and a chore of taking care of your diabetes, and you got to do it, into this thing that you're passionate about and you want to do. And the motivation really comes from, instead of that negative force coming in that you just kind of have to endure, to this positive thing that you're reaching for. Mm-hmm. And I find that it helps just framing it a different way.
All right, let's go back and talk about your story, because it is a remarkable one. But you were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 19. Did you already have experience sailing? Was this something that you did? Were you on the water as a kid?
I was. My grandpa was an amazing sailor, and he has amazing stories about hurricanes that he lived through, even up into his 70s and 80s. So the ocean was really kind of in my blood. And he would take me sailing as a kid, and I loved it. I was passionate about it. When my kids were about 1 and 3, I had spent, 4 years basically committing my life to them. And I said, okay, they're old enough now. I can leave them with my husband. Like, I can get some time away. I need to do something for me. And there was a local sailing certification class once a week at night for an hour. And I said, okay, I can sneak out for an hour. And so I took the class to get certified. And from there kind of built this dream, like, okay, I need to start doing something for myself, especially as a mom, because it's so hard to pull yourself away and have those times that are for you. And I kind of got, a lot more training, but it's always been one of my escapes to think about sailing off into the blue and leaving everything behind. I'm kind of an introvert, so that's a dream for me, is just sailing off alone. And so I just started making plans to make that a reality.
When you make plans like that, actually, before I go there, before we get to those plans, though, let's talk about how your life did change when you were diagnosed. Because you grew up listening to these stories. I'm sure you had these dreams as a kid. Were you worried when you were diagnosed that that was it, or did you take it in stride as a challenge?
I don't know if I was just stupid or arrogant, but, my doctor said, you can't sail alone, and you can't fly a plane, and you can't drive a big rig because, everybody wants to do that. And I never let that sink in. I just said, okay, yeah, that's great. That's a nice thought, but I'm going to find a way to do that. 3 days out of the hospital, I was on a backpacking trip. Like I say, I think I was just stupid. Like, I didn't realize, the full risk there. And, I packed up my Gatorade and my meter, and we were off into the middle of the woods. And I think just from the very beginning, it hit me at the perfect time when you're young in college and you think that you can do anything and you're invincible. And so I just kind of went with it. I'm like, okay, I got to test and keep my blood sugars and shoot up with insulin, and that's great, but nothing is going to change. It took maybe 10 years for me to start realizing that things slowly changed. But it wasn't that initial impact that I hear a lot, where you're panicked and you freak out, and it's a hard diagnosis. It didn't hit me that way. It kind of slid in over the next 10 years.
Were you very ill before diagnosis, or did they catch it some other way? I'm curious. That's a great mindset. I just wonder how you got there.
Yeah, I wasn't that sick. I didn't even realize it. I came home from college because I had a sore throat, and I still hadn't found a doctor at UCSD, so I would drive home up into Seal Beach, and my mom took me to the doctor, and she noticed that I had lost 15 pounds in a month.
Wow.
And I hadn't noticed because I wasn't focused on that. And, I was thirsty, the usual. I couldn't sit through a lecture without drinking water, getting up and drinking water, peeing at night. But other than that, I felt great. One day on my way home, I was riding my bike home up this huge hill and couldn't quite make it up the hill, which was unusual for me. But I figured, I was sick with a throat infection, and that was probably it. My mom was actually the one that forced the doctor to test me. He's like, oh, you look healthy, you're great, go home. And she's like, no, there's something going on, you need to test her. And she persisted, and he did, and I had gone back to college. So after I saw my doctor, I'm like, great, got my antibiotics, went back to college, and my parents called me 2 days later with results that I had type 1 diabetes, and my dad broke it to me and said, hey, we're going to come grab you and check you into a hospital down here. But I still was relatively healthy. I had blood sugars of like 480 when I got diagnosed. Yeah. So it hadn't run its full course, and luckily I didn't have to endure that for weeks and months, because that can be rough.
Oh, yeah. Well, when we finally got the call, and we had a couple of days after we had asked what was going on with my son, it took a few days. I still don't know what happened, almost a week to get the A1C, and they called and said, go to the hospital right now. And we looked at him, and he felt fine. I mean, he really was, it didn't seem to be anything too wrong with him.
Right.
And it's that odd feeling of, well, why am I going to the hospital? But then, of course, you realize, well, you happened to have been a good day. I mean, we brought him to the doctor for specific reasons. But we were fortunate as well. We were in the hospital for only 3 days. And then, of course, I wanted to stay because I was afraid to bring my 2-year-old home. But that's a different story. So did you have any issues when you went backpacking right away and all that? I mean, it just sounds to me like you did what you needed to do and went on with it. Do you mind sharing did you ignore it, or did you just take care of it and have?
No, I took care of it. I made sure that I had plenty of sugars, and I tested all the time. Like every hour we'd stop and I would test and, eat more sugar, give myself a little more insulin. And I think what it was is because we caught it so early, I still had a good chunk of pancreas functioning. And so I still kind of had that honeymoon phase, but like really strong honeymoon phase where things weren't as crazy as they got eventually. Whereas, if you catch it later, you kind of have more destruction, and so you don't have that residual pancreas function for that first, 6 months or a year. And I think that kind of tempered everything and made me believe that it really wasn't that big of a deal. I took care of it. I wrote everything down. I tested. I was way, better of a diabetic, I think, back then because I was so conscientious, I ate my meals according to my meal plan, and I did all that before I learned how you can, hack those things and learn the ins and outs of really dealing with it. But, yeah, I took care of it. I didn't have any severe lows. I didn't have any real big highs, which now, you go on a hike and you have to change everything. Yeah. Like, you change your basal rates, you change your overnight rates, you make sure you have all your food and your carbs. But, it was good back then. I had a great trip, and I really loved that a friend of mine forced me to do that, so that I was out there and knew, okay, I can keep doing this. I just need to, think about it a little more and stop every hour to test before the Dexcom.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, sure. So take us forward then. you're in this once a week for an hour sailing class. How do you get from that to saying, I'm going out on my own, 4 days?
I think a lot of it was that sort of, I don't want to say midlife crisis, but, you have your kids and you devote everything to them. And then you have this moment where they can somehow function without you for a little while. And I knew that at that point that I had to do something for myself. And I said, well, a big trip would be to go sail, 100 miles. 100 miles is a great number. I don't know why we love numbers like that. But I met up with a group of people in San Diego called Insular Independence. And they were doing crazy things. They were doing like Ironman races and 100-mile running races. And I would go to these parties like after a marathon and everybody would be like, oh, yeah, I just did a marathon and my blood sugars were perfect. And I'm like, oh, I woke up today and struggled through a 3-mile run. And just that sense of like, I should be doing a lot more and be able to, go to parties and say, hey, here's what I did and be proud of that. And I kind of let that go through, childbearing and the toddler years. And I wanted that sense of pride back.
All right, wait a second. I just have to jump in and say, and I want to talk about pregnancy and type 1 and kids and stuff too later on, but yeah. I have not run a marathon, but I have also been pregnant twice, had 2 kids and gone through toddlership, and it is, I would say, just as challenging.
It is, but nobody's asking you, did you hit a PR?
Right.
Yes, I slept for 6 hours. Exactly. It was my PR last night, It's just that different sense of wonder. It is. It's a tough trip. And I think I wanted to reward myself with time away.
Sure.
It's one of the reasons why I did it solo. Like I said, I'm a total introvert, and so having kids attached to my hip for 3-4 years solid, it's rough on me. Yes. And I'm like, I just want to go alone somewhere and not talk to anybody. And so I needed things warm, and I needed not just a random chunk of 100 miles, but I wanted to finish somewhere, kind of like a finish line. And for me, that was the Florida Keys. And so I started 100 miles from Key West and sailed down to the end. And once I got there, I was like, oh, I'm done, because there was nowhere else to sail. So it seemed like a perfect place. And I spent the next just about a year planning for a trip in 2010, which unfortunately I had to postpone because I ended up with hyperthyroidism.
Oh. Which
just devastated my body. So I put it off for another 9 months till February of the next year when we got things under control.
Do you mind sharing,
in 2011.
For hypothyroidism, would you mind sharing some of the signs of that?
Yeah, and it was, I want to say it was 100 times worse than diabetes, because diabetes is great 85% of the time, and then it kind of shocks you. Hyperthyroidism, one of the worst symptoms for me was I couldn't sleep. And I couldn't sleep for about a year and a half.
Oh, my gosh.
Because it's pretty much like drinking 12 espressos all day, every day. And so you'd think, oh, great, I got all this energy. But the problem is if you can't shut your body down to rest and recuperate, it wears out. And so by the time I ended up getting it fixed fully, I think it was 2 or 3 years that it slowly came on. Usually there's weight loss. For me, it was I turned into a total jerk. Kind of like aggressive and mean and short-tempered. Everything bothered me. I couldn't sleep, and so I went from running half marathons to not being able to do 7 minutes of yoga. I had to take off work. I ended up taking the kids to school and laying on the couch until I picked them up. So it really kind of devastated my body. One of the symptoms that most people end up with is weight loss and a huge appetite. I'm one of the 10% who actually put on 35 pounds. I'm like, finally, a disease with, a side effect you want, and I get the opposite one. Oh. So, yeah. And it takes a while because it happens so slow you don't realize it, and you're a mom, and you're like, well, yeah, of course I'm tired because I'm a mom, but it ended up being a little bit more.
Wow. And is that treatable with medication?
We had to, what do they call, ablate? We nuked my thyroid with radioactive iodine. Yeah, which was a fun experience all of its own, because you can't be within 15 feet of somebody for a week because you're radioactive.
You got your time alone.
Yeah, you might. Yeah. Oh, my gosh, it was great. It was like, I didn't mind it all that much. I got off work. I got to sleep in my office, and, you had to call out in the house, okay, I'm coming in, and everybody had to leave so you could come in and get some food. But, yeah, I didn't mind that part all that much.
That's funny, but I'm glad you're doing better. I'm glad that they figured it out and they were able to treat it.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so then when your plan for 2011, where did you get support from? Any medical support? I mean, you know what you're doing at this point. How do you plan for something like that in terms of the diabetes, not the sailing?
The diabetes, it's weird because I had been doing endurance since I got diabetes. One of the greatest things my doctor told me is that I'd have to work out every day. And so early on, I went to triathlon because I loved swimming. Running was easy, and I biked to school all the time. And so with endurance, you know, you turn down your basal rates, you make sure you have extra sugar. Sitting on a sailboat kind of was the opposite. So instead of fighting lows, I was fighting highs the whole time. So it ended up coming up with a system to make sure I was exercising on board on a small boat. So every hour I'd get up and do like lunges and squats just right there on the boat in the middle of nowhere. And one of the other problems is with a pump is you put insulin into whatever tissue, and if you're not using that muscle, you're not getting a lot of lymph flushing to get that insulin into your system. And so you're not getting the insulin you need. So, you know, doing squats and moving around helps with that. And making sure, just like when you fly, that you turn your basal, or that you don't overcorrect right before you get off board.
Right.
Because, and these are things that I had to learn going on my first day there. I was fighting highs the whole day, and so I corrected, and then I got off and had a 5-minute walk to the showers, and a whole day's worth of insulin just poured into my system. And so I went from 300 to like 32 within 5 minutes. It was insane. I've never dropped that low that quickly, you know, and so you're doing the usual, and just took a shower, and here I'm pouring out sweat in Florida, and, you know, shaking and eating everything I possibly could. Just learning the little tricks like that. I made sure I had a couple of sets of supplies because, you know, on board things can get wet, and you don't want all of your insulin supplies to get wet. And it was hot there, so you had to come up with a way to keep everything cool so you didn't fry your insulin. Luckily, a friend of mine loaned me, which I know is, you know, against FDA, but loaned me his Dexcom for the trip.
We won't tell.
Yeah, it was, you know, and so I had data for the first time. It was one of the first times I got to wear a Dexcom. And I don't think I would have gone on the trip without that backup. Because when you're sailing all day, if you're in the midst of something, you don't really have the time to stop steering your boat in the middle of nowhere and test. And so this way, it takes, you know, 3 seconds, I look down, I'm good, or it'll alert me if I need to know to do something. And that, I think, has really opened up my comfort level with doing these wild adventures, because I don't feel like I'm alone when I have, you know, my Dexcom with me, kind of looking over my shoulder and reminding me to test, or, you know, reminding me to take a look at my diabetes.
And let me just jump in when you talk about sailing, because you're talking to someone who, listen, I go on like a Royal Caribbean and I get seasick. I mean, you know, I definitely have no knowledge of any of this. But when you talk about sailing, to be clear, you are talking about doing all of this yourself with a vessel where you are putting up sails, taking down sails, right? You're not talking about something where this is automatic. You're working, right?
Yes, you're working for 10 or 15 minutes and then sitting for 4 hours. And so that sort of like rush, depending on the weather. On the third day I was there, I missed a small craft advisory, which basically is if you're in a small boat under 25 feet, don't go out. Well, I missed that on my weather report, and so I went out. So that was a day where I was doing stuff the entire time, just trying to hold on and make sure I was safe. And so you never really know going out what your day is going to be like. You know, you go out on a run, you're like, okay, I'm going to run 3 miles. I'm going to run probably at this pace. I know exactly what my blood sugars will do, and I can prepare. With sailing, you can't really prepare ahead of time. You have to react to whatever's going on. And it's different. Yeah, so I was on a 22-foot Catalina all by myself, so steering, moving the sails around, pulling them up, pulling down, everything was done by me. But a majority of the time was just sitting and steering for hours and hours.
Did you have communication with your family, with the Coast Guard, with anybody else like that?
If I needed the Coast Guard, yeah, I had a radio that I could call them. And then I could text my husband, which was so nice. Because there was still cell signal out there. I was close enough to land that I could do that. And those moments were fabulous. But, of course, he was chasing toddlers at home, so I didn't spend too much time, you know, taking up his time texting.
That's funny. Did you have any diabetes moments? As you said, you had that low when you got off to walk around because everything starts moving around. Anything when you were sailing that gave you pause or you want to talk about?
Honestly, it was just constant highs. And it was pretty consistent. I'd be 250 all day, and you'd correct and nothing would happen, and it was just constant highs. But nothing really that I didn't have any supplies get lost. Or I plan, and it's funny because one of my preparations is, okay, let's come up with 100 different ways this could go wrong. Like, how can my trip get totally destroyed? And let's plan for that, like, what happens if I fall off the boat? On a boat alone, that boat's not going to turn around for you. So that means I might have a 2-mile swim to land, and some of the keys down there are uninhabited. And if that happens during a storm, I'm going to have to stay on that island until it's safe to cross to another island. So let's make sure that I have enough to get, to safety maybe 24 hours later. So those kind of scenarios I would plan for. I made sure that I had gels on me at all times. I had my life vest. I had my pump. I made sure, which is unusual on land usually, that I didn't let it go below half of a cartridge. So that if I did get tossed overboard and I had to wait, I would still be good that way.
Did the insulin get cooked out there in the sun?
I kept it inside my shorts, so at least it was a little cooler. But yeah, it would. After a day or so, I'm like, let's change this out again and get some fresh insulin on board because it is blazing hot out there, and I didn't want to take any chances. We were joking about being alone, and wanting to have those moments. Did you have those moments, as you said, you're sitting around for 4 hours, but do you remember having a moment of thinking, I did this. I am so glad I did this while you were out? The entire time. From the second I stepped on the plane and I sat down and I realized people are bringing me drinks and I don't have to take care of somebody and I don't have to monitor somebody else's needs. I'm like, flying is the greatest thing ever. I didn't like flying until I had kids, and you're like, wow, this is great. But every single moment for the entire 5 days, I was on a high. One of the last days, I went out. I planned on going for 4 days. And so the third day, I pulled into port, and I pulled into the near side of Key West. And then the next day, I was going to go around to the far side of Key West. Well, the weather got so bad that it wouldn't be safe to go out. And so instead, I spent that entire day on a cruiser around Key West. And that moment of just like, these are the things I've dreamed about seeing, and here I am. I finished my sail. I'm riding around on this cruiser, enjoying a town that I'd only read stories about. It was the greatest high. I'd survived it. I'd done it. That moment of like this, last 2 years of planning, of beating my hyperthyroidism and getting here was fantastic. And that led me through, the next year on that high. And that's one of the cool things is like, yeah, the experience was 5 days, but that moment of knowing I did something cool and something that I'll always remember, it sticks with you. And it gives you confidence doing every other little thing that you do in your life.
Wow, that's remarkable. That's just great to hear. Because in your day-to-day life, you are a teacher. You teach junior high school. You teach middle school kids.
I do. I teach them science.
Before we talk about your next sailing adventure, tell me about that, because my son's in 6th grade. I have a sophomore in high school. My daughter, my older child, is in high school. First of all, much respect to every middle school teacher.
Thank you.
Is it harder than sailing?
Yeah, it's harder, one, because of my personality. I'm in front of, 35 kids, and I'm on stage, and you really have to perform for them. If you want to keep them engaged, you have to keep them entertained. And that daily grind of, being on it and being on stage and making sure that they're engaged, because if you can't get them interested, you don't have behavior problems.
Wow. I
know that I have a bad lesson when my kids start screwing around. I'm like, okay, that one's no good because they're not into it, and so they're going to find other ways to entertain themselves. And so that constant, trying to find the best way to get them interested. And then, of course, just talking all day and and being in front of an audience is, it's rough. I enjoy my breaks.
Have you had any kids with type 1 in your classes that you know of?
Yeah, I have, and I actually request that all the type 1s get filtered through my class.
Oh, that's great.
So any type 1 that we have, I don't have any this year, which is unusual. Usually we have 2 or 3. Yeah, and so they are in my class. I'm very upfront about it. My Dexcom's going off in the middle of class all the time. My students know what that means. At one point, I was teaching the human body every year, and so we would go through, here's type 1 diabetes, here's type 2 diabetes. And it was part of the curriculum that I got to explain it. And for some of these kids, it's the first time they've seen an adult with type 1.
Yeah.
Drinking the juice boxes like they do and having the high days where they feel groggy and having their alarms go off in the middle of class. I also sit on all the IEPs for our type 1s so that the teachers understand the reality of, if a kid's low, they can't take a test. Like, if they're not feeling like they're focused, there's a reason for it. They're not making it up. And I kind of try to advocate for them on that so that our staff understands.
That's great. And then I should just jump in. IEP is what? Individualized Education Plan?
Yeah, or their 504, yeah.
Okay.
It helps teachers understand what we need to do to accommodate a student with any sort of medical or mental health issue, so that we know, hey, look, these are the things that are going to happen. You know, the student will go low. They do need to see the nurse. They will have to use the bathroom. They're not just faking it. And you need to let them do that. So it explains to them because, I have 180 students with 180 different needs. And so for me to have something, with a student as important as type 1, I got to know ahead of time what's going on so that I can help them be successful.
That's really great. Wow. That's very cool. All right, so you go back to school, you go back to your family, you are on this high for a year, and then at some point you say, let's do something again, let's do something else, and you decide to swim around Key West, because you already sailed it. So tell me how that came about, because this is with a team of people, right?
Yeah, well, I realized after about a year my motivation was fading again. I was letting things slide. I wasn't testing as much. And I wanted to be around people. I know, shocking for me. And so I'd done triathlon for about 10 years. I would come out, 5th or 6th out of the water after the swim, about midway back through the pack after the bike, and I would finish up a lot of my races dead last after the run. And I said, why am I killing myself biking and running when I don't like them and I'm not good at them? And so I decided to focus on swimming. And once again, I needed something warm. It's a great race down there. I knew the city already, and I decided that I can't do 12 miles, at least not at that point. So there's a 3-person relay, and I found a team of 3 other type 1s, and we took on the 12-mile swim around that entire island.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a great trip. We had a couple of support people. We had Katie, who went on kayak next to the swimmers, and we had a couple people in a boat kind of to bring all our supplies and our food and our water and everything else. How
do you find 2 other type 1 swimmers who want to swim 3 miles? Are these friends of yours? Do you put an ad out somewhere? How do you find other people?
For that trip, I'm lucky in that I feel like I live in diabetes Mecca in San Diego. I was already with, Insulin Dependence, which is this group of just crazy type 1s who love to go out and do things. And so I pulled from that group of people. And we had 2 other fantastic swimmers. One of them was an all-college triathlete and just fantastic. And the other swimmer was just this amazing, just great swimmer.
What's different
and
about...
we trained.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
What's different about swimming than sailing in terms of managing type 1? I would imagine the constant motion. My daughter's on the swim team. I swam in high school. And I just remember, I don't have type 1. I was in great shape and I was always hungry.
Yes. Well, the cold water makes you hungry. Usually you run and your body temperature rises, and so it kind of diminishes your appetite for a while. Swimming, because you're in the water, it increases your appetite. Yeah. And the other problem is I was on a mini-med pump, which is not waterproof.
Not waterproof.
And so I'd have 2 or 3 hour swims, and during all my smaller swims, I would take my pump off, I'd swim, I'd put it back on, no big deal. But when my swims got longer and longer, I had no basal insulin on board. And I would end up 400 for 7.5 hours. Every time, couldn't bring it down. It just was 7.5 hours, and then it would drop back down to normal. And it was that trip that actually convinced me to do something kind of unconventional. I use a basal insulin, Levemir, for 75% of my basals, and then I do the other 25% with my pump and all my boluses with my pump. Because I still like the ability to bring down my basal after a hard swim, or if I want to, eat and that sort of convenience. But I needed to have something that would cover me for those couple of hours when I didn't have my pump on. It's been an amazing system for so many different reasons. But so I really, after swimming and having this problem, you kind of start problem solving. Okay, how can we fix this? What's causing it? How do we address that? And each year I do this, I come up against new problems. And so I'm brainstorming again, which for me, I love having a problem that I have to fix. It kind of gets me focused on my diabetes again, if it's new and challenging and not, the same old boring diabetes. So it helps me focus there. But with swimming, like you say, you're swimming, and so your sugars usually go lower. So I use GOO energy gels, which are packaged so I can throw them in my bathing suit. For the actual race, I had them strapped to my water bottle that the boat crew would throw me, so I could take a goo if I needed. I had to find a way to waterproof my Dexcom because I needed to have sugar readings. So I found one of those waterproof iPod carriers and fit right in. I strap it to my back, and I would get data the entire time. Until I just flip it around and take a look at it, or I could feel it buzzing if I needed to stop and do something. So just all the little different systems that you end up developing, they were great.
Did you stay on the Untethered? Do you still use that when you're not swimming?
I do. Yeah, because now I'm paddling on the water, I'm still swimming, and I'm always doing something. In the summer, I surf a lot, or I go to the beach with my kids, and I don't want to have, a pump hanging off my bathing suit, so I go without it, and I'm active enough that it perfectly balances out with the 75% basal. Because I would have normally turned down my basal when I'm that active. So this way I'm just already there by taking my pump off.
That's great. And I'll link up more information as you listen to diabetes-connections.com on Untethered, or some people call it poly, pumping on long-acting. So it's really cool and interesting to have options like that. I'm glad you brought that up. We've talked about doing that when we go to like a water park or the summertime, but we have the Animus, which is waterproof, and my son does not at this point want anything to do with more shots. So
yeah, that makes sense.
Whatever works. So then you talked about paddling. All right, so the next big thing I have on my list is that you did this stand-up paddling. Right, I live in North Carolina, and you were up the intra-coastal waterway. That is a cool area.
It was. It was gorgeous. Yeah. So after, spending a year staring at the bottom of a pool, I decided if I'm going to go to a new town, I would like to see what's there. And I think one of the best ways of doing that was stand-up paddling. So I'm still on the water. I wanted to be active. Sailing wasn't quite active enough for me. It was great when I was, broken down and hyperthyroid, where I didn't have much strength, but I was ready to take on something new. And I know the weather's still warm. My grandpa had told me sailing stories of going up the intra-coastal waterway, so it was kind of always one of those, trips that I had wanted to take. And we started in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and paddled up the intra-coastal waterway to Wilmington. And this time, I didn't have friends who paddled, so I put it out there on the web. And I put it out on my social networks, and I had an application process and came up with 3 other teammates who were incredible. I mean, picking at random people, it's amazing that we all got along so well, that, everybody was focused. There was nobody who was whining or crying, and it was a great team. We had 2 other type 1s and then a type 1 researcher who, wanted to, she is I want to say a type 1 nurse, and she does research, and she wanted to know what the reality of doing these kind of crazy adventures was firsthand. So she came with us and watched it all and saw, the crazy things that happen. When you have 4 people, that's 4 more chances for things to go wrong with diabetes. We had Dexcom changes on the water. You pull up to the mud flats and changing a Dexcom. We had one girl with her last pod, she was on the Animus, and she dropped it in the water as she was trying to fill it up. And you're like, that's your last one. Like, what do you do? I had some, I was doing shots all day, and my Humalog pen, I think it was a quick pen, it turned out it wasn't giving me any insulin. And so I would correct, and it didn't work, and I'd correct, and it didn't work, and I'm like, what's going on? So you start, just shooting it to see if anything was coming out, and nothing was. So I wasn't getting any insulin that I needed for corrections. Luckily, I had backup, because you always bring backup for your backup. And, with 4 of us, there was enough to back even that up. But, one thing after another would go wrong, and we'd stop and fix it and keep going.
Yeah, and I'm sure that that's not the kind of thing someone in a clinic, as that nurse probably was used to seeing, somebody's not dropping. I assume it was an Omnipod if she's dropping a pod in the water, maybe.
Yeah, okay.
So you're not seeing somebody, you can drop an Omnipod, you can drop it on the floor, but you're not dropping out of the building when they're when they're in the doctor's office. So that must have been really interesting for her to see all that.
Yeah, it was great. And just to, because doctors don't always fully understand. And I got back from a new endo who I was showing off some of my blood sugars on my One Drop app. Days that I was so proud of. I mean, I had a day where I was an average of 135, which never happens for me. That's like the unicorn day for me. And she's looking at it, she's like, oh my God, there are some 200s here. What was that? And I was like, are you kidding me? Like a straight line across the whole graph and like two little blips of 200. I'm like, just the reality of yeah, I know we should all keep it at 120. That would be great. But, 200s happen. Yeah. And, who remembers why they happen? They happen so often. And it was just the shock on her face that somebody would possibly go to 200.
Send her my way.
I didn't show her any of my other days. I'm like, okay, if that freaks you out, we're good. We're stopping this show.
And you're probably in terrific shape. I mean, that's funny that they well, she needs some education. I'm sure you can help.
Right, I try. But, it's hard because there's a difference between the theory of diabetes and the practice.
Oh, yeah.
And the theory is, yes, we should all have 100s blood sugars all day long. And in theory, if you carb count precisely and you eat the right foods, then yes, sure, it'll stay 100. But it doesn't work like that. There's, stress. Whoever accounts for stress. Do we have a stress monitor to up our basals based on our stress level? Like, there's, sickness. For me, I can't watch a scary movie because guaranteed my blood sugars shoot up to 300 if I'm watching a scary movie.
Wow.
And nobody ever tells you that. But I get so, into it and stressed that my blood sugars rise.
That would be me.
Right? And so I just don't watch them anymore. I don't like them. Luckily, I didn't have to, give it up. But, yeah, it's a stressful thing. And there's so many different factors that go into it that it's not just carb counting and exercise and basals.
We, and I'm going to talk about this during this episode, when I do a little chit-chat before I bring you on. But my family recently took what I would call for us a travel adventure vacation for my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. We went to the Galapagos Islands. And it was amazing. And we snorkeled every day and we hiked every day. And my son, just turned 12. But we had talked about doing this trip a few years ago. And I'm so glad we waited. And not just because diabetes, but because the grandchildren, including my kids, were way too young to appreciate any of it. My son is the youngest at 12. But when you talk about if your endo had seen our numbers for this trip.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, and I loved our numbers for this trip. He was usually... I made sure before you talk about planning, before snorkeling, I wanted him in a certain place. And then, we had like one crazy high and one crazy low. But for the most part, I mean, I say crazy high, I mean like 450 because the cannula was big. But, for the most part, I'm like, okay, 180, perfect, 220, perfect to snorkel, that kind of stuff. And it was all about, and my mother worries because she doesn't live with us every day. She doesn't see it. Is everything okay? But it was one of those times where I said diabetes is not going to keep us from this adventure. I'm not going to worry other than the preparation for lows and things like that.
Right.
And I'm so glad we were able to do that. I'm glad I had the time of 10 years of this under my belt because I don't think I would have been able to handle it that way. And he got to snorkel, he got to swim with sharks and penguins. It was crazy. It was crazy.
Exactly. And in the long run, I mean, we're talking, 60, 70 years of life. You have to live a quality life.
Yeah.
You have to go out and enjoy those things and experience those things. And, if you run 180 to do that, it's for a week. You know how many weeks he's going to live, with better blood sugars, 1 week for that in exchange? Yeah, I'd gladly pay for that,
Let's talk about your kids for a moment, if we could. I'm curious if you want to talk at all about pregnancy. I know you're not here to do a whole show on diabetes and pregnancy, but I get that question a lot from young women or, women who are thinking about it. And you have 2 kids. How old are they now?
I do. They are, my son's about to turn 11, and then my daughter's 13.
Okay. So similar to me. That's funny. So do you remember at the time, did you do a lot of planning for a type 1 pregnancy? Were you in just good health and worked with your endo?
Well, I read that, for 3 months before you even try, you have to go in and check with your doctor and make sure things are good. And so I went and I checked with my doctor, and I said, hey, we're thinking about getting pregnant, and so what should I do? And my doctor's like, you do know how that works, right? You go get pregnant. I'm like, okay, well, I'm just checking in like they told me to. He's like, go take care of it. But I didn't have that much information, and so I didn't realize how quickly my blood sugars would jump up. I want to say almost the very next day. I had, overnight blood sugars at that point were great, consistently just perfect. And all of a sudden they were 300 at night. And they stayed 300 for the first month until I could get, the first pregnancy test. And so had I known ahead of time, I probably would have made quicker basal changes. But, I was a little queasy and I didn't want to go too low and not be able to eat food. And so I didn't react as quickly as I should have with that first pregnancy and changing up my basals. The pregnancies went well. I had an amazing diabetes pregnancy doctor who was fantastic. Like, he honestly, it was kind of nice because I would fax 10 years ago. I'd fax my blood sugars twice a week, and he would change my basals for me, and he would change my carb ratios for me. So for 6 or 7 of the last months, I didn't have to do any of that. And finally, somebody was doing it for me, so it's kind of like a mini vacation. And yes, my numbers were all over the place. Not as good as I would have liked them, but I didn't have a Dexcom back then. I was doing finger sticks, and, I would do them 10 times a day or whatever. But, I had 2 beautiful, healthy children. They both were, by C-section, they both were, pretty fat for babies. They had the big old fat diabetic belly because I fed them a little too much sugar. They lost that weight in the first 2 days of life. But we delivered them both the first day of when they're full term. And, my daughter, she wasn't quite ready to come out. She had wet lungs, which means that she hadn't quite gone through the starting process of you release a different chemical as a fetus to dry out your lungs and get them ready for oxygen. So she was probably a day or 2 before she should have been delivered, but she was fine. She spent, 2 nights in the NICU, breathing good, clean air. And I have 2 very healthy babies.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Do they understand what you've accomplished, or is it like most kids where it's like, ugh, Mom,
Oh, no, we've drummed the lesson home to them. My husband is a paratriathlete, so he competes in the physically challenged division.
Wow.
He was born with a bilateral club foot that has been corrected, but there's still a lot of change in bone structure and stuff, and so he races that. So we have pumped this message into them. You have your challenges, but you keep doing it, and you do it for yourself, and you do it for, to show a good example. So my kids have heard this lesson a million times. I think they get kind of, what I'm doing. They're proud, I think, because a lot of times, and it's so easy to fall into this, moms especially lose themselves in their kids, and they forget to do something that they love. And so they end up, just not having that super big passion. And I think that my kids appreciate that I still do that.
I think it's one of the best things we can do for our kids is to continue following our dreams, to show them that you can, you can't have it all at once. And there are times when I feel like I'm not doing my best for anybody. But I worked full time until just a couple of years ago, and I'm so glad I did, even though how hard it was. You've got to show your kids that they can dream big, and it doesn't have to stop. I mean, and maybe your dream is to be a stay-at-home mom, and that's okay too.
Right. Oh, certainly.
Yeah.
And then, but to find some part of that is just for you.
Just for you. Yeah.
That whether that's that you build these amazing homemade meals, or you have the greatest design house, or whatever that passion is inside that you're doing that one just for you. Because like I said, we lose ourselves in our kids, and then they go off to college, and we don't know what to do.
Yeah.
You're left trying to rediscover. I remember the first couple times I could leave the kids for an hour. I'm like, all right, my husband and I made a deal. Each week, one of us, will go out for an hour each by ourselves. And I went out, and I'm like, I don't know what to do with myself. I forgot what I like. Okay, and you'd sit there for a while, what do I enjoy? I don't even know anymore. And kind of that rediscovery of what you like to do.
I had read at some publication when they were talking about you and your family that you had thought about grabbing the kids and your husband and doing a sail or doing a family trip for a year. Is that still a dream of yours?
It is. I don't know if it's going to happen because my kids have such different passions. And because we bought a sailboat last year and they hate it. And I took them out and they were, freaked out, and I took them out on a big day, and they just don't, they each have something that they're really passionate about. So for them to learn, to sail and to learn all those rules, they just don't love it. My daughter's a ballerina. She's a dancer.
Oh, nice.
And she spends, 20, 30 hours a week doing that. My little boy is a skateboarder. So he's up at skate camp right now, and that's all he wants to do. And like I say, my husband is a triathlete, and he can't really train on board a small sailboat. So I've let that one go for now, and I just kind of support them in their dreams. And I don't know if we're going to be able to sail off for a year, unfortunately.
I meant to ask, is your grandfather still alive?
He just passed away this August.
Oh, so were you able to share your experience, these accomplishments with him, the solo sail and all of that?
I was, yeah. I gave him a copy of my book, and he told me, it feels like it was written by an old salt, which, in sailing terms is like the highest compliment you can get, that you're truly a sailor. And it was so nice to be able to share that with him. One of the stories in the book is actually about him and 4 buddies. They went on a sailing trip. They were going to go down through the Panama Canal, and they were all above 70. They were all in their 70s, still out there sailing, and they hit Hurricane Mitch. They actually were hailed by the Coast Guard and said, "Hey, guys, you need to get out of here. Like, we need to come rescue you." And they're like, "I'm not leaving my boat." I'm like, "All right, well, if you don't leave your boat, I need the name of your next of kin." They're like, "All right, I'm leaving my boat." So they had to, like, be rescued. You know, it was 30-foot waves and 60 to 90 mile an hour winds, and it was a full hurricane, and they had to jump into the ocean to be rescued by a tanker. So I got to go through all of his research and write that up as one of the little stories in the book, and then show that to him, which was a good moment for me.
Wow. Well, I'm sorry for your loss, but I'm so glad you were able to share that experience. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
So Adventure On, which is your latest project here, and I'll link it up at diabetes-connections.com. This is a workbook as well as sharing your experiences. How it's got the compass on the front, and you talk about your adventures. Is this something that someone who perhaps doesn't have a real physical background could use in their diabetes?
And that's really what it's meant for, is like, let's say you want to go for a 3-mile hike next year. How do you get from here to there? You know, how do you pick something that's going to be big enough that it challenges you, but small enough that you'll actually achieve it? And it's meant for everybody everywhere, not just going out on these crazy, weird, 8-day trips. But, let's say you want to go to New York and you want to drink coffee in every cafe on the island. And so you're going to spend, 5 days walking around and drinking coffee. You got to get prepared for that, or whatever it is that you want to do. If you want to go check out every used bookstore in an area, or, and you're just going to walk from place to place, or whatever it is, that it should get you in a new place, because that helps. Just being in a new place, it helps your senses, it helps your brain. You should have some sort of activity to it so that you can train. And that's one of the greatest things is, if you know you have it, you're going to work out. Because exercise is one of the absolute best ways to manage diabetes. And, a 20-minute walk around the block every day is fantastic. Like, if I'm honestly, I'm a pretty lazy trainer until it comes time to actually start my 6 months of training. And so I'll go a couple of days without, any exercise, and 20 minutes, all of a sudden my body's responding to insulin again, of just, walking around the block, taking the dog out for a walk. But having that sort of physical stretch where you're going to stretch yourself to just beyond what you do right now, so that you're making progress in your exercise and activity goals. And so, it just kind of, it is definitely for the person who, is doing nothing right now. You've heard of the couch to 5K plans for learning to run a 5K. It's that sort of, let me meet you where you're at, and let's just move it a little bit bigger.
And it's a perfect time of year to start thinking about that kind of stuff. Do you have anything on tap, any big projects you're working on for this year, or were you just prepared for a book tour?
Nope. Luckily I finished my books in the fall, and then I start training in 2 days for my 6 months. This year we're doing the One Drop Caicos adventure. So we're going to the Caicos Islands, which is an island chain. We're going to do 120 miles over 4 days.
Wait, like Turks and Caicos, like in the Caribbean?
Yeah, Turks and Caicos, yeah. So for the first 2 days, we'll do 50 miles of stand-up paddling, and the water is just amazing out there. For like a mile out, it's only 6 feet deep.
Wow.
So it's beautiful and crystal clear. So 2 days of paddling, we'll camp on a deserted beach, and then we're going to do roughly 15 to 20 miles of, there's an island chain between 2 of the bigger islands with a bunch of little mini cays, they call them, 9 of them. And so we'll walk the length of the cay and then swim in between them, and then walk the length of the next one and then swim in between them until we get back to our main home base. And then the 4th day, we're going to do 50 miles of cycling on electric cruisers. And so, like cruiser bicycles. Because I'm not fast on cycling. I didn't want to get back on my road bike, and we're going to tour the entire island for 50 miles.
Is this trip set? Are the participants set, or are you looking for people?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
No. So each year in August, I'll open up applications for whatever my next crazy adventure is, and then filter through applications. And I got a team of 3 other Type 1s this year, and we're all going to head down there in June.
Wonderful. That's fantastic. If you're looking for a media correspondent, you've got,
Yeah.
I'm not swimming between islands, but I'll bring my microphone.
Put you on a boat.
That's so great. Oh, well, keep us posted. I'd love to learn more as you go through this.
Yeah, for sure. That'd be great.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking about all of your accomplishments and motivating us in the new year. I think this was a great way, to kind of kick things off and talk about big goals and small goals and what works. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. It was great talking with you.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
More information on both of Erin's books, on all of her adventures at diabetes-connections.com. And as I said during the interview, more information about hyperthyroidism, what that is, and what the signs are as well. I will link that up. And remember, we are giving away a copy of Adventure On. And you can just enter that contest on Facebook. Go to Diabetes Connections on Facebook and comment on the post, and you are entered to win. Contest will end on Tuesday, January 17th. You can enter on the 17th, but please go ahead and do that. That's on Facebook. And you can find Diabetes Connections on Facebook, on Twitter as well. I'm on Instagram as Stacey Sims, and I post for the show over there quite a bit too. And I'm Stacey Sims on most social media. You can also email me, Stacey@diabetes-connections.com. And I'll tell you what, if you enjoy the show, if you like what you're hearing, make sure you are subscribed. You can subscribe on any podcast app. I know most of you listen on iTunes or Stitcher, but there's like 24 at least podcast apps out there. So go ahead and subscribe. That'll make sure that immediately, as soon as the show goes up, and it often goes up Tuesday at midnight, or I guess Monday night at midnight, really early in the morning, Tuesday, Eastern time, you will get the show as soon as it uploads. Or if you're listening on the website or through Facebook or Twitter, that's great too. Do me a favor though, hit share, hit retweet, let somebody else know about Diabetes Connections. I really appreciate it. Have a great beginning to your 2017. I'm Stacey Sims, and I'll see you back here next week.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.